Hilchas Issurei Mizbeach Perek Shishi. Kshem shemitzvah li is called korban tomim v'nifchar. So you learn b'niger korbanos is a din tomim. Tomim means it shouldn't have a mum. And then there was also a nifchar. That's not enough that it shouldn't have a mum. It should be a nifchar. He gave an example of there's a yabelis in the loiven sheba'ayin that doesn't have seyor. So it's not a mum. But on the other end, it's not a mufchar. Al derech zeh, if the horns were completely taken off, that's a mum. Masha'inkin, there's a little bit left of the zachrus of this keren. So even though it's a little bit left, so it's not a balmum, but on the other end, it's not a nifchar. So he says, Kshem shemitzvah liyas kol korban, tomim v'nifchar, this kach anasachim are also supposed to be yiyu tmimim v'nifcharim. They should also be tmimim v'nifcharim. Shenamar, tmimim yiyu lechem v'niskeim. So we learn out, the pashtus v'niskeim is also going on tmimim. Sheyiyu hanasachim tmimim. The nesachim should also be tmimim. And what does that mean? Shaliyavi nesachim le mi'ayin musham. So the nesachim of niske yayin shouldn't come from yayin musham. Now, pashta taish yayin musham sounds like smoked wine with smoke in it. But bring from the Pirush HaMishnah is that he says that it's yayin that was in a keli that had a bad reach, and that bad reach gave a psahevel into the wine, and that causes a certain strength in the wine, and that causes that the wine shouldn't be as good as it was before. That's yayin mu'ushan, yayin that was in a keli with a bad smell, and that gave a hevel into the wine. Or v'lei seila she'esliya, or you have seilas, flour, which is wormy. And you shouldn't also mix the seilas with oil, which is reiche etaimira. So the Rambam is giving you common examples. Now he says tmimim v'nefcharim, that the nesachim should be tmimim v'nefcharim. I'm not really sure. Over here also we're speaking about two madregas, a madrega of tmimim and mufcharim. Later on we're going to speak about things that are also lechatchila it shouldn't be, but b'diavad is good. So that's b'pashtos. The things that are even b'diavad no good, so that's the pshat. It's not tmimim. Mashenkin, those things that b'diavad are good, that felt in nefcharim. So the Vayla were saying shaliyavi that this is going on that it's not tmimim because lepel b'diavad. If you brought yain motion or seila shesliya or shem and shereche etay merah, so it's tak apostle. V'chein, that's b'nigeh the nesachim. V'chein atzei amarocha. The atzei amarocha is also liyu el nefcharim. Atzei amarocha should also be nefcharim. V'liyu b'em tvilas. There shouldn't be any worms in the atzei amarocha. V'chol eitz shesliya k'shehulach is possible Mizbeach, because even if you're going to take it out, it will always be nickered that there was a tilaz there. However, Isliya Yavish, if they got a worm while it was already dry, is Geirer is Hamokim Shesliya, then you could take out the place where it was Isliya. You take also not only the tilaz, you take out also the Mokim Shesliya, and it won't be nicker, so therefore you could take it out. The V'atzi Stira, Eitzim that was used for something else, in other words, it was built for something else, and now you took it apart, and now you want to use it for maracha, is psulim le'elam. Because liyaviu elech chadoshim. You're not allowed to bring for atzei maracha only eitzim chadoshim. So nacham also atzei maracha. There's also a din that they have to be nefcharim, and that's pshat that it's not allowed to be a telaz. That's din number one. Then it's saying another din that atzei stira psulim le'elam. That's pashas not a din b'sad demum. So new din that atzei stira psulim le'elam. Now the ma'aseh d'shal is what's the mocker for this idea that atzei maracha is not allowed to have a psul. So the Rambam brings from the Aruch HaShulchan that he says that it's a kal v'chemer. What's the kal v'chemer? Madach behema, which even if it was used lehedget, it could be used legoveya. And nevertheless, there's a psul of mum. So eitzim, which is more chomer, because if you use it lehedget, you can't use it legoveya. So certainly there's a psul of mum. That's azak kal v'chemer. Brings also a Radvaz. The Radvaz says that since eitzim are called a carbon, atzim haracha called a carbon, so memela, so therefore there's a din that just like a carbon is not allowed to have a mum, atzim haracha is also not allowed to have a mum. So on that there's a deal, because first of all there's a machlekes in Gemara, machlekes tanoim, whether or not eitzim are called a carbon. And even if you do hold that eitzim are called a carbon, could be only atzi carbon are called a carbon. In other words, when you bring eitzim betur matana, betur nedava, the eitzim itself, Masha'inkin, if you atzei maracha, the pastors aren't called a carbon. He brings them in chaschinuch that they're not called a carbon. So it's a shtickle dion. What's the mocker? This idea that atzei maracha are not allowed to have a mum. But I'll call upon the Rambam saying it behemshich that nesachim shouldn't have a mum be mufcharim, and atzei maracha doesn't say a mum. It says liyeh elen nefcharim. Halacha gimel. Hamagdish yayin posel. Someone was magdish yayin posel, which he mentioned before, yayin mushin, a selis yishem and posel, a eitzim sulam l'mizbeach, hari hadover sofik im doimul balmum ki behema, and there behema v'leika. No, it doesn't have a din like a balmum. The din is if you're magdish a balmum l'mizbeach, you're leika. So over here also, since you are magdish these things which l'mizbeach, and we're saying that there's a isur of a balmum, so there is a, so it's also doimul balmum ki behema v'leika. Or they don't have a din of a balmum. Lefichach ein leika, since it's a suffix. If he's chayiv malchus, so bepel you can't give him malchus misafik. However, umakanesa makas mardis, he definitely did an avla. The fact that it was magdish yain postel or seilus yishemen postel or eitzim which are psulim mizbech. So over here, yeah, it says psulim mizbech. Halacha dalet. Hasoilus v'hayayin v'hashemen v'halavena v'ha'oifes v'ha'eitzim u'klei sharis shenifsulu eishenitmu ein poidenoisen. Shenama v'hamid v'herach. So we learn out kol sheyeshnim ba'amoda nerach ve'elu einom b'chlal amoda lefichach einom nivdun leila. We have a din that kochim, if they became, you have kochim that let's say became a balmum, so now they're not royal akrova, so there's a musik that you could be paid it. So l'chura, if you have these items, selis, yayin, shem, and levaina, or oifis and eitzim and klisharis, all these things which are kaddish, and they became, and they're ineligible. Shenifsulu nitmu. They're not shaykhs to use them lamizbeach. So the question is, could you be paid to them? So the seichel would say that just like a behema which is kochim, you could be paid it. So al derech these things which are kochim, you should also be able to be paid it. So on that, I'm saying no. That since there's a din v'hamid v'herach, that when you pay the behema, it has to be v'hamid v'herach. Most of the behema dies, you can't be paid it. That's another din, because you're not paid the kochim lachil and leklovim, but there's a din v'hamid v'herach, so it has to have a mod in order to have a roch, and only then there could be a ptiyah. It's called sheyeshne ba'amoda is nerach. In order to be nerach, it has to be yeshne ba'amoda. But ve'elu einon bechlal amoda, they're not bechlal and together of amoda. Lefichach einon nivdum le'elam, so that's the din that these things, selis, yayin, shem, and leveina, Ephus, Eitzim, Klishara, Shanifsulu, Shanitmu, there's no pidyon. Because there's no Vehamid Veher, there's not Shachar to Hamad. And that, Bamedvar Mamurim, when is this din that it's not Shachar Hamad, that since there's not Shachar Hamad Varocha, so therefore they can't be Nivda, the Shanifsulu, a Shanitmu, Achash Niskacha Beklisharas. Because when they were Niskadish Beklisharas, they became a Kaddish of Gdushas Aguf. So they became Kaddish Gdushas Aguf. So now the question is, could they be Nivda? So in order for something that's Kaddish Gdushas Aguf to be Nivda, you have to have a Hemed V'herach. Avol Kedim Sheis Katsha Bekeli, before they became Kaddish with Gdushas Aguf, Im Nitmu Oy Nifslu is paid Neso. That you could be paid to them. So in other words, something that became Nifsale Nitma, before it became Kaddish Gdushas Aguf, you could be paid. Now this, what is this tzir? Marshal Selis or Yayin, Shemin or Levena, is Shaychas and Metzias that they would never Kaddish Kedushas Aguf, they were never in a Klisharis, they were never in a Skachu Klisharis, and mainly even though you were miyachad them to use for a mincha, but Lepel Mamish, they were never in a Klisharis. So therefore, so these four things, Selis, Yain, Shem, and Levena, never became Kaddish Kedushas Aguf. In Geya Ephus, there's no Kedushas, there's no Keli. When a person is Magdish Ephus, it's not Shaychas to say that it was in a Keli, not in a Keli. Now there is a Eitzim, now there is a Klisharis. Klisharis becomes Kaddish Kedushas Aguf when you use it. When you use the Klisharis for whatever you have to use it, that's Mikachosam. So once it gets a din of a Klisharis, so then it becomes Kedushas Aguf. So it's also not Shaychus L'chura this Inyan. So this Bamedvar Mamurim, the Parshas is going on these four things, Selis, Yain, Shemin, and Levena, that were Nifsal. So it depends if it was Nifsal before it became Kaddish Kedushas Aguf or after it became Kaddish Kedushas Aguf. That's so we're saying that if before it became Kaddish Kedushas Aguf, you could be paid it. Avol Tahirim, when could you be paid it? If they became Tamei or Psulim. Psulim means it became a Tilas, a Tiloim, and others. Be'efim because that you can no longer use it. Lemizbeach, it became Ushim. Masha'en Kein Avol Tahirim, they're Torah, there's nothing wrong with it. Is Avol Pisha Adayin Likochu Bekalim. It didn't become yet Kaddish Bekalim, ain't paid in Esau. You're now going to be paid when a person was Magdish, Selis, Yayin, Shemin, Levena, and he was Magdish to be used to Mizbeach. So even though lepel it wasn't Kodesh Kedushas Aguf, and therefore if it was Nifsalu, you could be paid it, and you could be paid it, even though there's no Vehemet V'erech. But if they weren't Nifsalu, you're not allowed to be paid it. You could only be paid it if it was Nifsalu. And the Chiddush is that there's no Vehemet V'erech. But if they weren't Nifsalu, you're not allowed to be paid it. Chutz miminchas chete, shenamer ba mechatose al chatose. Minchas chete is there's a din of a carbon elevated. Carbon elevated is if a person does certain averes. The Parsha talks about in Vayikra. One of them is metame migdash v'kadoshav. So if he's an usher, so he has to bring a kizba. He has to bring a behem, a regular chatas. If he's an ani, he brings shnei terim, shnei b'nei yena, echad lechatas v'echad leila. And if he's a dali dalus, so then he brings a mincha. Now, if he was makriv, first he designated a mincha to bring for his carbon because he was an ani, and then he became an usher, so he could take that mincha and be paid it and use that money towards the kizba seira, which he's supposed to bring now because he's an usher. And that we learn out from the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Vehevius Hashami LaHashem al chatosi asher chata." He brings the Hashami LaHashem. He brings a carbon osham, a nekeva and saying kizba yisiras izim lechatos. He brings a regular carbon chatos, and v'chiper olav hakein mechatose. He's mechaper mechatose. So we learn out mechatose that from the chatos that he already designated as a mincha, he could use al chatose. He could use for the kizba, which means he was paid this. Is nachamal. When a person is magdish a mincha, so normally you could not be paid it unless it became tummy. If it became tummy, so even though if it became tummy, so if it was already kadosh kedushas haguf, in other words, it was already in a klisharas, there's nothing to talk about. But if it wasn't kadosh kedushas haguf, so then you could be paid it. If it's tor, you cannot be paid it. But in the case of a minchas chete, over there you could be paid it even if it's tor, and you paid it and you use the money to buy this kizbo sira together with other money. That's what he's saying. Chutz minchas chete, shenamer ba mechatose al chatose. So you bring the behema al chatose and you use mechatose. You use the money that you set aside and the mincha that you set aside because you were an ani. Leimer shemevi chatose midmei chatose. He could bring his chatose, which means the kizba midmei chatose, from the money that he used. That from the money that he got for the mincha. Knows he's paid the mincha, and that money he uses to buy the kizba. Lefichach koydem shediskadish b'klisharis harei kedushes domim and memelu paid neisaf al pisheiteir. So this din that you're allowed to use the mincha for the dmei chatos, for the dmei kizba, is only as koydem shediskadish b'klisharis. Koydem shediskadish b'klisharis has a din of kedushes domim, and you can be paid the aval pisheiteir. That's this din. Then the Rambam says weiter, v'chol hanesachim shnitnu. The Rambam saying a new din. So it says one din was that normally a mincha, which a mincha that was tummy, that was not niskadish b'klisharis, all these menachim, the nesachim that were not niskadish b'klisharis, and they became nitmu or nifsalu, you could be paid to them. You could be paid to them because they weren't niskadish b'klisharis. If they're still toher, you could not be paid to them. However, b'negei minchas chete, there's a special din that over here you could be paid it. If this minchas chete, this person was a chete and he was mafresh a mincha because he was an ani, and then he became an usher. So even though the mincha is still toher, nevertheless he could be paid the mincha and go ahead and use the money for a dmei of a kizba. He could use the money of the mincha for the kizba. That this din. Now that's only if the mincha wasn't niskadish b'klisharis. If it was niskadish b'klisharis, then you could not use that money because it's already kaddish. It can't be nivda. Now that's the number one. Now the Rambam saying nochadin v'chol hanesachim shenitmu, and you can't be paid to them, so you have to burn them. Is oisel ha'maracha b'fnei atzma and v'sefer b'fnei atzma v'sefer b'mizbeach. So the Rambam saying you make a maracha on the mizbeach, a separate maracha, and you burn those nesachim shenifsalu. In other words, they don't become part of the maracha gdela, which you're makar of the karbonis. It's a maracha b'fnei atzma. It's on the mizbeach. Now the Gemara says a limud that to be ser from bazor because it says bakedesh beishti sorif. So Rashi says the Gemara is vachim. Rashi says that it means it's al ritzpas azor. It's not on the mizbeach. It's ritzpas azor bakedesh beishti sorif. So there's a din that it has to be nisraf lifnim and amachitza. And the Rambam is saying that it's nisraf on the mizbeach, but it's a maracha b'fnei atzma. Halacha Vov. Me'achag shenitmu. If the me'achag, the mayim, for nisach hamayim, that nitmu, they became tummy, and then the hishikon. Now, in order for mayim to become tor, you mashik it, you connect it to a mikvah. You take the water, let's say in a keli, you put it into a mikvah, or you connect it to a mikvah. So then that mayim becomes tor. It's not a gather of tefillah, it's a din of zriya. In other words, you're connecting this with the mikvah, so it becomes tor. Shenitmu v'hishikon v'tiaron kimei she'izbor b'taris, that's how you matayr mayim. Is in tiaron. If you had water that you took it for the nisach hamayim and it became kaddish, and now you went ahead and it became tor. In tiaron, v'achar kach kigdishon. If you had water that was once tummy and it was never kaddish, and then the water that was tummy, and then you were matayr the water, and then you went ahead and magdisham. That's not a problem. You could go ahead and be menasach mayim, even though this mayim was once tummy. But since the smayim became tor through hashaka, that's no problem. If this water was once already kaddish, and then it became tummy, so memela it became dochui, and now you were hishikon, so be'emes l'churi you were matayiret, but you were matayiret. But lepel was something that was tummy, it became tor. Is hail v'nitchu? This water was nitchu, is yidachu, is nachma. Water that was never kaddish, and then it became tummy, and then you were matayiret, and then you were magdish, is not a problem, because the fact that it was once tummy is not a problem. Masha'inkin, over here, this water was already kaddish, and then became tummy, so it became dochui. And now you want to, so to speak, correct it. So the rule is hail v'nitchu yidachu. It became nitchu yidachu. Halacha zayin, zeisim v'anovim shenitmu. If you have zeisim and anovim that became tummy, so the oil which is in the zeisim, or the wine that's in the anovim, aren't really tummy. It's considered like there's zeisim and there's wine in this, and there's oil in the zeisim. There's anovim and there's wine in the anovim. So when the oil is going to come out of the zeisim, the question is the oil going to become tummy? Is the oil going to become tummy, or is the wine going to become tummy? The wine isn't tummy because the zeisim became tummy, and the wine isn't tummy because the anovim became tummy. It has to become tummy. Now the din is, in order to be matami, it has to be a shir of a kibetza. Oichel that's matami is the shir of a kibetza. If it's not a kibetza, it's not matami. So if you go ahead and you take zeisim v'anovim shenitmu derchem pachas mikibetza, you use less than a kibetza to you squeeze out less than a kibetza at a time. Memela v'hamashkin hayetzim ksherim l'nesachim. That mashkin never became tummy. Shamashkin mufkedu ba'oichel. The mashkin is not part of the oichel. If the mashke would be part of the oichel, so then once the oichel became tummy, the mashke became tummy. But if once we establish that the mashke is mufked b'teichayel, it would be like something like mashke in a glass. So when the glass becomes tummy, the mashke didn't become tummy. The question is, the mashke has to become tummy through through it being made tummy. So on that we say shamashke mufkedu b'eichel ukilu eini megufei, and therefore it can only become tummy if the oichel, while it's coming out and becoming mashke, if it's touching something which is a kabetza, only then could it become tummy. If it's touching something which is tummy, which is less than a kabetza, it won't become tummy. Halacha ches. Maili yiseira osu chacham b'kochim. Shezroim shenitmu. If you have seeds that became tummy, is afilu zaron hayetzi mehem, then you planted those seeds, and then those seeds grew other seeds. So those seeds that grew from the seeds that were planted, that were tamei, is psulun l'nesachim. Those seeds cannot be used l'nesachim. Shein zriya me'elis b'kochim. So in other words, even though it was planted, it's still l'gabi kochim, is still retained its din tumah, and therefore the zroim that are coming out of those zroim also have a din tumah. So even though we learned before that the wine that's coming out of anovim, as long as that wine, as the wine was there before the anovim became tummy. So and the wine is mufkid, is placed in the anovim. So now we say that even though the anovim are tummy, but the wine that's in the anovim are not tummy, and when the wine comes out, so it didn't become tummy because the anovim were pachas mikabetza. Over here, it grew from something that's tummy. Over here, it's growing from something that's tummy. So the din is that even though it was planted, it still retains its din tumah, and then when something grows from something that's tummy, it's also possible. She'ein zriya me'elis b'kochim. The Ibn Ozel explains that earlier we learned that water that you made hashaka, so it's still possible. The Mizbeach is also part of this din because hashaka is the din of zriya. It's like it was planted. It was like planted into the water. When you put it into a mikveh, it's not tvila. It's more zriya. You connect it to the water. And since we're saying that zriya doesn't really change the din tumah, so Remela retains the din tumah legabi kachim. So Remela is pasul mizbeach. That's how Devin Ozl explains that din of the mayim that you were you made ashaka. It's still remaining tummy. Yeah. The Ram really says the lashon hail v'nitchu yidochu, but I'll call upon him. Here it says that ein zriya me'elis bekachim, it remains tummy. V'chein ha'etzim v'halavena. Eitzim and Levena. Now, Bechlal, Eitzim and Levena are not Oichel. Only Oichel is Mekabel Tumah. Eitzim are not Mekabel Tumah. Levena also is not an Oichel as it is a Levena. Nevertheless, Aval B'She'enam Oichel, Eitzim and Levena are both not Oichel, is Harehem Mistamim K'Oichel Inyan HaKorbanos. That's another mile that Chacham made in Kachim. One mile in Kachim is that even though you planted something that's Tomei, so what grows from it also has a din of Tumah, Mele it's possible. And over here is another din that Levena and Eitzim could become Tomei, Le'inyan Korbanos. V'yifsulu ha'eitzim v'alevena betum mezula mizbech. Ve'im makrivenesa. So if something Tomei touched the Levena or the Eitzim, so the Eitzim and the Levena become Tomei, Mele they become Pasul Limizbech. Halacha Tes. Now, until now we learned that there's a din that just like Korbanos have to be Tmimim Mufcharim, al derech zeh the Nesachim have to also be Tmimim Mufcharim. If you have nesachim which are puzzle, so the shalos could you be paid it? Can't you be paid it? It was neskacha bekeli. It wasn't neskacha bekeli. Kama pratim beneged this din. The shalos is what makes something puzzle. What makes the nesachim puzzle? So here the Rambam is going to go through what makes yain puzzle, what makes soilus puzzle, and what makes shemen puzzle, and what makes it shalem and amufcher. Halacha tes. Ve'elohein hayenis hapsulun legam mizbeach. These are the yenis which are puzzle. First thing is hamosik. Hamosik is it's sweet. It got sweetened by itself. Vice versa, it's a sweet wine. I'm not 100% sure. Doesn't mean that there's sugar or dvash in it. That's another psul. But over here, we're talking about the wine is a sweet wine, and that's considered a psul. That's number one. The hamu'ushan, we said, was that it was put into a keli that has a reach ra. That caused the hevel in the yayin. That's a second psul. And also, v'hamavushel be'esh b'shemesh. It should be ad, not oi. Ad shenishtana time bebishul. In other words, it got cooked to the extent where you could be margish that it's cooked wine. Shamish be'eshe b'shemesh ad shenishtana time bebishul. Then it's considered cooked wine only if it was nishtana time bebishul. Aval yayin shemecham neise b'shemesh v'lein nosne b'tam bishul. That's not considered wine which is puzzle. Yain shemecham meise b'shemesh v'leinos natam bishul. Now the Rambam is going to give a list of those yanis which are not puzzle, but they're not menamufcher. Is nachamal. If it was mosik, or is mu'ushin, or is mavushel be'esh, a b'shemesh achin nishtana timer b'bishul. If it was mavushel be'esh, we're not going to go look if it's nishtana timer. If it was mavushel be'esh, it's mavushel. Masha'enkin, if it was mavushel b'shemesh, is only if it was nishtana timer b'bishul. If it was mosik, mu'ushin, mavushel, be'esh, or b'shemesh, but in b'shemesh it was nishtana time of b'bishul, it's possible. But if it was yayin, shemecham mesim b'shemesh, it was just warmed in the shemesh, aber v'leinos nebetam b'shul, that's one situation. V'chein yen tzimukim, wine that came out of raisins. The yayin megite, which is wine that never fermented, it's wine that's fresh wine, shalishar boim yem. And also the yain hadolius. Yain hadolius is the vines weren't lying on the floor; they were like on top of reeds, on top of kanim. That the vices then the yain is not as good. The wine that comes out of those grapes that are now lying on the floor aren't as good. And also v'yein kerem hanatua bebeis hashalchen e bebeis hasvolim, a yain that comes out of a vineyard that's from bebeis hashalchen. Bebeis hashalchen means a place which is not enough the rainwater which it gets. You have to constantly irrigate it. Ebe beis hasvolim, what beis hasvolim means. Either beis hasvolim means near the ash place, or beis hasvolim, there's another pshat, means a place that needs a lot of fertilization, a lot of zevel in order to fertilize the land. Oy yein kfanim, or wine of vines. Shenizra zerbi name, that seeds were planted. Now normally if seeds are planted it becomes kilai akerem. But over here we're talking about seeds which are not edible seeds. It's not going to make it kalayim, but lepel, it causes a weakness in the vine, so therefore the wine that's going to come out of those grapes aren't so good. Oy yein kerem shlei nevad, it's coming up from a vineyard, which is lei nevad, which doesn't have the normal work that you have in a vineyard. A normal vineyard, you have to dig around the vines, around the root of the vines, in order for it to have water, a place for water to gather, and that's done twice a year. Mashenkin, if it's a neglected vineyard, so therefore the grapes that come out of such a vineyard is not such good grapes. It's kol elo yenis, all these that he mentioned, starting from the yain shemecham mesi b'shemesh v'lei nosen b'tam bishul. So all these yenis is lei yavi lechatchila v'mhevi kosh. However, if he was hevi, is kosh, is nachamol. There are yenis where apsulim. Apostle is mosek mu'ushan mavushul beish. A b'shemesh at shenishtana taimei. That's called apostle. What's called lechatchila leyavi, which is not min amufcher, that's it was nishcham and beish, but it wasn't nishtana taimei. It was tzimukim, yain migite, yain adolies, kerem natua beis hashalchem beis hazvolim, a kfanim, which is nizazera b'neim, a kerem shalei nevad. So all these things leyavi lechatchila v'mhevi kosher. Now yain shenis gala, yain that was revealed, is possible legabe mizbeach. So the pashto pshat is because if it's revealed, it's asur b'achila, because there's a concern that a nochad drank from it. But the mice is that the Alter Rebbe brings this din in Shulchan Aruch in Reish Ayin Beis B'negei Hilchos Kiddush, and he says even bisman you shouldn't use kiddush from wine that's nizgala, even though bisman hazeh we're not makpid on yeinish and nizgala because it's because ein hanochash mitzuyis b'neinu, so mele it is not really a concern of a nochash, so it is mutter b'shtia, but nevertheless it's not min hamufcher. It's called akriveyu no lepechosechos. It's not min hamufcher. Because if it's not min hamufcher, it would be b'diavad kosher. Over here, the Rambam is saying it's possible. Yain shenizgal possible gabi mizbeach, because this goes into together hakrivei no lepachasecha. Just like we learned, b'negei atreifa, behemoth that's a treifa, is also possible lemizbeach because hakrivei no lepachasecha. It's not something that you would give to someone that's a sar if you would want to give it to a boss of adam or to a ruler. Is nachmal is yain shenizgal possible gabi mizbeach, even if it's not aser b'shtiyah. A hidla geffen al gabi teina, you took a geffen of wine and you put it on top of a teina, on top of a fig tree, is yein apostle in the sochem. Why? Mipnei shenishtana reiche, because since it was on top of a fig tree, so the smell of the wine changed. And Areyuema, the pasuk says zevach u'nesochem, so we learn out ma zevach shalei nishtana is af nesochem has to be shalei nishtanu, and even if it was a shinui, that was a shinui only legabe the reach, but nevertheless that's called a shinui, and memela it's possible. So that's the yenis with apostle. The yenis the apostle that he said in the beginning, that was the musik and the ma'ushin and the mavushal be'esh b'shemesh nishtana taimei, and then he's talking about a yain shenizgal is possible, and also hid legefen al gabe agena is also possible. And the other ones are lechatchila you shouldn't use, but b'diavad you can use it. Halacha yudalef. Now he's talking about soilus. Soilus for menachas. So for the Nesachim, Selis, Shehisliya Ruba, that most of it got worms in it. Got worms in it. Oi, now we say there's worms in it, so there's different ways of learning. Obviously, if the worms are there, you can't use it for menachas. The question is, you obviously took out the worms. There could be two ways. Either it was very wormy and you took out the worms, but Lepel was very wormy originally. That's one option to learn pshat. Or to learn pshat that you have a big keli full of soilus, and most of the keli, let's say you have, most of the keli has worms in it, but there's a part of the keli that worms never got to. So since most of the keli there were worms, so even though you're only going to take from that part of the keli, that's how the Radvaz learns, you're going to take from that part of the keli, which there were never worms there, but lepel, since it's coming from a keli, which most of it was wormy, so memeli you're not allowed to use it. That's a soilus shesliya ruba. If most of it had worms, even though you're taking from the part of the keli which has no worms, so nevertheless you're not allowed to use it. Oi, another option is hisliu reiv hachitim shenasis mehem. There's the wheat which this salus was made out of. Most of this wheat had worms. The most of those kernels of wheat had worms, even though lepel the worms aren't in most of the chitim. Of most of the sailors, so there could be, you used a certain amount of chitim, and now you have a lot of seilus, and there are worms there. But lepel, the worms are not were in most of the chitim, or were in most of the chitim. So then, since they were in most of the chitim, even though they're not most of the seilus, so that's also a problem. So hisriu reiva chitim shnasis mempsula. So it could be also if you have a pile of chitim, and now most of those chitim, I mean, it could be also that before you made the flour. In other words, you have a pile of chitim, and you take a look and you see most of those chitim have worms in it. And there are some chitim that don't have worms in it. So now you're going to go and pick out those chitim that don't have worms and use those chitim and make salus and use it. So we say no. Since it's coming from a pile of chitim, which most of the chitim have worms in it, so that disqualifies all the chitim. That's the pashtup shot. Hislio reva chitim shnasis mamsula. And then, so you know, now you want to take the chitim that don't have worms and use them to make flour, you're not allowed to. That's one issue. Then there's hislia reiv chita achas. So again, the chura, the pshat is that you have a pile of chitim, and they all don't have worms in it. But there's one chita that's mostly, in other words, if you have a chita that has a worm in it, so you take that chita out and you get rid of it. If you have most of the chitim have worms in it, you can't take out the chitim that don't have worms. If you have one chita in that pile that's not only has a worm in it, but it's completely wormy. So it's reiv the chita. So that's a suffix whether or not that causes to disqualify all the rest of the chita. So memela is a suffix. That's a suffix. It's a suffix whether or not you're allowed to use it, and therefore obviously you shouldn't use it. And then the Rambam says, continue, v'chol seilus shenisha bo kemach. There's this seilus and this kemach. Now the kemach is like a certain powder. Seilus has more of a texture to it, and that's the flour, fine flour. Masha'inkin, the kemach is a powder, a powdery substance. And therefore, seilus, shanisha bo kemach, if there's like the powder of the kemach in it, so that's psula, that's also possible. So again, what are we learning again? The psulim of seilus. Psulim of seilus is hislia ruba, that most of the seilus has worms in it, and even if a part of it doesn't have worms, so never, you can't take that part. Or hislio reiva chitim shnasis mem. In other words, you have reiva chitim, which there was chitim that the seilus was made out of, and roiv of those chitim were hislio. So you're now allowed to use the seilus that comes from chitim. That roiva chitim were hislio, or hislia reiv chitachas. You had a pile of chitim, and one of those chitim was hislia rubai. So that also disqualifies all the rest of the chitim. That disqualifies all the rest of the chitim. Is that enough? That's a suffix. Haslia reiv chitachas. So that's a suffix whether that disqualifies the rest of the chitim. Then the Ram continues. V'chol seilus shenisher bo kemach is psula. Now, ketzad beitkim. How could you see if there's kemach in the seilus? Machnes hagizber yodel l'techa seilus. He puts in his hand in the seilus. If his hands comes out and it's completely clean, it means there's only seilus there. Masha'inkin, if there's dust on his hand, is psula. So that means that there's kemach in the seilus. So mela so you have to go ahead and sift it through to make sure that there's only seilus and not kemach. So all these things are psulim or maybe a suffix possible. Avol seilus chitim shenizru bebeis hashlochim bebeis hazvolim, just like we had before. Benegei gefen, which was bebeis hashlochim, which means it's thirsty for water. Of bebeis hazvolim, either it's not a good land which needs to be fertilized a lot, or it's bein hashbeis. That's another option. Oy bebeis oilam, it's a place where trees are growing, and memela the trees are taking a lot of the nourishment from the ground. So memela the chitim that are growing there can't be that good. Bebeis oilam, ebo oretz shelei nora, or a land that you didn't plow. And those normally the seder was, like we're going to learn in the next parak, that you first you plow the land and you leave it, you don't plant it, then you plant it the next year. But over here, Aretz Shalei Nora, you didn't do that. Or V'lei Avda. V'lei Avda will learn also that there's a land which was never plowed before. So even if you were Nora, so when it comes the following year, you have to plow it twice before you plant it. We'll learn about it more in the Perek Dalet. So if it's either Aretz Shalei Nora or V'lei Avda, is Lei Yavi Lechatchila. Lechatchila, you shouldn't bring this for Menachas. V'im Hevi Ksheira. However, Imhevi is kosher. So again, the Rambam is telling us what's puzzle and what's lechatchila leyaviv Imhevi kosher. Which again, that's the idea of there's mumin and there's also she'enim and amufcha. Then the Ram Halacha Yud Gimel, chitim shaloktam migloli habehema. You took chitim which came out with the golol of the behema, which with the waste of the behema, and then you took these chitim v'zorim and you planted it. Is harei lusafik im avra miusam bizriya. And it now grew from those chitim, grew chitim. Now the question is, could you use the chitim that grew from seeds that were planted from gloli behemoths? Is it mos? So we say that over miusam bizriya adain hemusam lefichach leyavi mehem menachos. It's a suffix. However, im hevi is kosher. Lepel if you maver is kosher. Halacha yudalad ve'elein hashmanim apsulim. What are the shmanim that are apsulim? Shemen shel gargerim shenishru b'mayim. If you have shemen shel gargerim, I'm not sure what garger means. It means you have olives, which first is not such good olives. Say some roim they touch. Not such good olives that are soaked in water. They weren't actually pickled in water. Whereas to call pickled, it has to be soaked for 24 hours, or in vinegar. Mashenkin over here, they were soaked in water. They were soaked for a considerable amount of time. That's one option. That's one Indian that's shmanim psulim. Shel zaysim, which are kvushim eshlukim. Those regular zaysim, not shem shel gargerim, but regular zaysim. But the fact that they were soaked in water wouldn't really make them puzzle, but that's only if they were pickled or they were cooked. Zaysim kvushim eshlukim. Oy shemen shel shmarim, oil that came out of the dregs of oil. Oy shemen sherechi ras, an oil that has a bad smell, is called elu psulim. So these are shemen puzzle. Again, shemen shel gargim, which are gargim are not such good olives, which soaked in water. Shel zaysim kvushim, or if you have regular olives, but they were pickled or cooked, or you have the oil of dregs, or you have oil that doesn't have a good smell. Aval shemen zayis shenote b'beis hazvol b'beis hashalchim, which we had also b'negei yayin and b'negei selis, that it was planted in a beis hazvolim, in a place which needs either it's around ashbase, or it means it's a place which is not such good soil, and therefore it needs a lot of fertilization, needs a lot of zevel. A beis hashalchim, a place which is thirsty for water. A shenizra zera b'neim, or there were seeds planted around these trees. A shemen sheitziu mizresim sheli bishlu, olives that weren't yet fully ripened. El hadayim himpagim, they're still in the beginning of their ripening process, but they're not. But they're still olives and they have oil. Is kol elu leyavi, they're not the preferred oil, they're not the best oil. However, vim hevi kosher. So that's the three things we learned about yayin, selis, and shemen. There are those things that are puzzle, and there are those things which lechatchila leyavi vim hevi kosher. Halacha tezvav. Kol hamanochis v'nesachim kshedim mihaaretz michutzlor. There's no hechrich to bring menachos and nesachim dafka from Eretz Yisrael. It's also good michutzlor. And also min hachodesh min hayoshim. Min hachodesh min hayoshim over here means from the new crop, from things that grew that year, or min hayoshim, things that grew in previous years. The main thing is that it should be proper. There should be things that are proper, like we learned till now. Chutz except for the minchos eimer and minchos te'alechem, she'einen boim elul machodesh, they only come from the new crop. There's the eimer is the first tzvua that comes being matter the chodesh, and al derech zeh b'negeh the she'alechem is being matter the chodesh for reishis. The bikurim is reishis, is considered the reishis of the karbonis of the menachos elul min hachodesh, and also me'eretz Yisrael sai oimen and shtayim shtei alechem could only be brought from Eretz Yisrael.